So first off, this is the last set of formative stuff for ecology. Also, if you hear some screaming or talking in the background, it's just a toddler who is wanting to learn ecology as well. He's standing here looking at my screen. Hi. Hello. There you go. So it's going to be a series of four lessons. This is going to be the longer of all of them, and it's just kind of the main four areas that we as humans interfere with ecosystems, and that's kind of the theme that we're going for here. So the first one we're going to talk about is nutrient cycles. So when you look at your food webs, this picture is kind of breaking it down. You have animal waste dead organisms, which get broken down and get put back into the abiotic environment. So you're putting the nutrients and minerals and stuff back into the soil, and then it goes from the abiotic environment through producers into living organisms, and then goes up the food web, and then that stuff eventually gets broken down, putting back into the cycles. So what you got to understand about these nutrients is that they move. They're always moving around, and living organisms are part of how it moves, but there's also other ways stuff moves as well. So here we go. So interesting enough, these are the four main elements that make up life. And if you look at, I mean, we use the word carbohydrate interestingly, right? But essentially, I mean, it's just a protein molecule basically. Like all living stuff is made of protein, and these are the four molecules that make up protein for the most part. And the nutrient elements are the elements that organisms use to supply their body systems and activities. We get them from the soil, from the air. In fact, we get some of them from the sun, like vitamin D. We get that from the sun. Can you think of some other places we get them from? Or is that the main spots?
That's the main spots.
Yeah. And then all the nutrient cycles do, and we're going to look at a few of the nutrient cycles, is just describe how these cycle around. Like when you look at the Earth, it's by and large a closed environment, right? It's a closed system. So the nutrients and elements we have on Earth pretty much stay the same. I mean, sometimes we hit with meteorites and all that stuff, but generally speaking, what's on Earth is on Earth in terms of matter. I mean, energy, we're always taking energy in from the sun, but that's pretty much it. So these cycles is just showing how it moves around. Okay, so there's two factors that are essential for life. We need energy, okay, and pretty much all life on Earth gets its energy from the sun. And I think we go into that a little bit. So that's the main source. There's a few kind of living kind of microbes and stuff that live deep in the ocean that use the heat off of volcanic vents, chemotrophs, but by and large, it's all from the sun. And then nutrients. So you need energy and you need nutrients. Otherwise, looking at like nutrition, right? There we go. And then so the first cycle is the one. I think you do this grade 6, 5, 7, something like that. You probably saw this
And
in
geography again. Yep.
Yeah, it's in geography, and it's just the water cycle. So we know we have water up in the atmosphere. You have water stored in mountains through glaciers. Water comes down, and if there's too much water on the ground, it runs off. And all the stream is basically groundwater that's at the surface, and it'll run off into streams, into lakes, et cetera, and eventually end up in the ocean. Now the ocean and lakes and streams and stuff, they heat up, and then they evaporate water back into the atmosphere. And the kind of the engine for evaporating is the solar radiation. And we also have water underneath ground, where it'll soak into the ground, get deep, run into the groundwater, but still end up in the ocean. So essentially, it's water in the air, it comes on the ground, or it also rains in the ocean, obviously, and then most of the evaporation happens in the ocean. And then it ends up going back up into the air and then rains again, or snows or sleet or hail, right? Any of the precipitation. So that's basically the water cycle. Any questions about that one?
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, I think it's pretty simple. I mean, there's some interesting things going on. Like there's a lot of water that gets stored in plants and soil and stuff, but yeah, it cycles. Okay, so there we go. That's what I described: evaporation, transpiration in the atmosphere. Water comes into the biosphere via precipitation, and then it returns to the hydrosphere versus through runoff, or infiltration into the ground into the lithosphere. But the plants need water for photosynthesis, which supports all life on Earth. This is why you don't have a lot of plants growing in the desert. And by the way, the Arctic is a desert as well. We don't think of it that way, but it has very, very poor liquid water. So plants need liquid water for, well, liquid or gaseous, I guess, water vapor for doing photosynthesis. And if they don't have it, then they can't do it. So there you go. The carbon cycle, this is the one that you probably hear about the most because it's the one that we're really concerned about. But it talks about the movement of carbon. Now, carbon's a very interesting element. It's probably the most chemically, not active, but it's involved in more chemicals than any other, I guess, atom, right? So if you look at all the chemicals we know of in existence that we know of, basically half of them have carbon in there somewhere. It's a very sticky substance, right? It likes to stick to things. So the best place to kind of start with this is there's three main areas that we store carbon, right? We store carbon in the atmosphere in the form of CO2, so carbon dioxide. We store it in living organisms. I mean, our tissue, like the protein, the stuff that makes us up, has carbon in it. And we're carbon-based organisms, right? It's a very common element in us. So we store it within living things. So if you think of like a little, bunny rabbit or a link, right? They have some carbon in them, but these massive trees, right? They have tons of carbon in them. The soil even has carbon built into it. And so it's mostly plants store a lot of carbon. And then we also have a ton of carbon down in the soil. It's actually deep down in the rocks. So some rocks actually have a ton of carbon in them. And more importantly, let's see if the student in the chat can get this. What's the big store of carbon that we have underground? Do you know? Any thoughts? I don't know. Well, it's oil. That's what oil is. Oil is basically stored carbon, right?
Fossil fuels.
Yeah, that's why we call them fossil fuels. Because, I mean, we make a joke saying it's dead dinosaurs that get buried underground, but it's actually not dead dinosaurs. It's typically like petrified forests or like estuaries or mangrove forests that got buried under sediment and then buried down, and then anyways, it's a very complicated process, but you basically bury it down, and a couple million years later you have oil, and that's a big store. And so the rocks actually store a huge amount of carbon, and what we're doing is what's happening is and you do a lot of this in grade 10 when you talk about climate change, is we're actually taking that carbon from the ground and throwing it into the atmosphere, right? But the natural process, well, here's us throwing it in the atmosphere, right? But there is a natural process where microbes and other bacteria and stuff on the soil, I mean, they do their whole thing, and they're always breathing out carbon dioxide, and plants, can contribute to carbon dioxide as well, and specifically animals, right? The higher level consumers produce quite a lot of carbon dioxide, okay? But also when they die or use the bathroom, they're burying some carbon back into the ground, okay? So nonetheless, generally it's a pretty balanced cycle, and then we're just throwing this little wrench in it here. But you can spend years and years and years studying the carbon cycle. But there we go. Questions about that one? Anything you want to add?
I think we're pretty good there.
Yeah, I spent years and years and years studying this cycle. I'm one of my degrees is in climatology, climate physics, and I spent 4 years in university studying this thing. So it's interesting stuff. Okay, so carbon is the basic element to make up living things, and we find it in all four of our spheres: the atmosphere, biosphere, lithosphere, and hydrosphere. Like I said, the vast majority of storage, almost, most of the storage in the lithosphere. We have quite a lot in the biosphere, and we have an ever-increasing amount going into the atmosphere. We do have some in the water as well, which is another problem, creating acid, killing coral reefs and stuff. Yeah. The carbon dioxide mixes with water, creates carbonic acid, and ends up killing off coral reefs. So. Okay, carbon cycle is always moving between abiotic and biotic, and we're going to see in a few minutes through these processes that carbon is one of the main elements that plants use to convert sunlight into chemical energy for us. So it's photosynthesis, which is being done by producers, and cellular respiration, which all living things use. So photosynthesis, this is the process of taking sunlight, some carbon dioxide, some water, and turning it into oxygen and stored chemical energy. So food, sugars, otherwise known as carbs, carbohydrates, carbon and water, carbohydrate, right? You hydrate, you drink water, carbohydrates. Yeah, and so the food is stored for later use, either by the plant, right? Because the plant uses its own energy, or by us if we come along and want to eat the plant. And the nice thing is that when plants do photosynthesis, their waste product is oxygen, which we need, right? And they also need it as well, surprisingly enough.
Mhm.
So cellular respiration is animals and plants, they take in sugar and oxygen, and we break it down and release energy. Okay? We let go of water and carbon dioxide. You notice that's the same thing that we use in photosynthesis, but yet we're releasing during respiration. And the most important thing is plants do this too. Right? The only difference is that they don't need to eat the glucose; they just take it from the storage. Right? They're already
Yeah.
kind of making it, so they just use their own energy. So how they get it is a bit different. But what you got to know is plants eat too, and this is why like if you leave your celery in the fridge too long, it eventually will wilt, but it'll start kind of breaking down. It's because it's eating itself. Um, maybe that's not a fair example, but plants in the winter they eat themselves, right? They're not doing photosynthesis, so every day they're eating themselves, but they're also producing their own energy too, right? So don't think of respiration as being animals and photosynthesis being plants. We both do this. Anything else? I think we get into the formulas here.
Mhm.
So these are the formulas. I'm pretty straightforward, right? So we got the carbon dioxide and the water, and then we're reacting, right? That's what the arrow means, is reacting, and we're using sunlight to create the reaction. Sunlight is powering the reaction, right? And we end up with this funny thing, C6H12O6. Now there's a lot of different forms this could be. Right? It doesn't have to be those numbers, but it has those three main elements, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. And that's known as a sugar or a carbohydrate. And we release oxygen. Okay? So basically just the hydrogens from the water flipped onto the carbon dioxide to create these sugars and releasing oxygen, using sunlight to create the energy to do it. Cellular respiration, you just take the photosynthesis and flip it backwards. And so now you have the sugar plus the oxygen to release energy. This time that arrow is now releasing energy, and it creates carbon dioxide and water on the flip end. So we've basically taken light energy and turned it into energy that we can use. That's basically what happens there. I don't know how much more we want to say about that. It's also like when you're working on an exercise and you use a ton of oxygen because you're breaking down a lot of this energy, right? You're trying to really get a lot of energy, so you're using oxygen to do it, and that's why you end up breathing a lot. So, anything else we want to add to that?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, because they're just, it's the same process, just flipped, and all we end up exchanging at the end of the day is
Yeah.
light energy from the sun to energy that we use, and that's
Yeah.
basically what's happening. The only thing I would mention is this stuff, what it all happens in where the mitochondria, pretty much.
Cellular respiration is mitochondria. Photosynthesis is chloroplasts.
Chloroplast. So those are little organelles inside the cells. So this is happening inside your cells. Okay.
So chloroplast is what makes plants green because it has chlorophyll in it, which is the green color.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
There you go. Okay, other parts of the carbon cycle. So photosynthesis and respiration are main parts of it, but I mean, there's other things we do, like we burn oil and gas, wood, coal gets released. Carbon dioxide also goes in the oceans, and like we said there, it creates an acid that ends up dissolving, whatnot, ends up helping to make it hard for shellfish and stuff to maintain the calcium in their shells, or coral maintaining calcium. So there's the carbon cycle. Hey, carbon cycle and climate change. I mean, we spent a whole unit on this in grade 10, but basically, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere works as a giant blanket. So it, light from the sun has no problem getting through it, but then when the Earth heats up and releases energy, it catches it, and so it's like putting on a giant jacket. So the thicker the jacket, the hotter you get. And so by us putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we're causing it to retain the heat more, or longer rather. And that's how we warm up, right? That's why we call it a greenhouse gas. If you've ever walked into a greenhouse, a glass building, or think of your car, right? If you go into your car on a hot day, when the windows are rolled up, it's quite hot, and that's because it's working as a greenhouse. It's trapping the heat. So we're doing the same thing to our atmosphere by putting the carbon in there. Okay, well, we're clearly not going to read those. Okay, there we go. So let's go through two other cycles, nitrogen and phosphorus. So the nitrogen cycle, this one actually involves, without living organisms, this one wouldn't actually cycle. So this, I always find this to be the most interesting kind of cycle, right? And so what we have are nitrogen fixating bacteria in the roots of certain plants, legumes, and they fixate one kind of nitrogen. Okay? And then we have bacteria in the soil that then is going to go ahead and convert it to another type of nitrogen combined with like decomposers are also putting this in there. And then eventually we end up with these nitrates. Okay, so at the end of the day, we end up with these nitrates, which are what the plants end up using for it. And then these nitrates also get broken down by other kinds of bacteria, which release it back in the atmosphere as N2, and then the cycle continues. But it really only enters in through roots of certain plants, which are nitrogen fixating plants, and then gets modified in the soil by other kinds of bacteria to cycle.
So any kind of bean or clover has that bacteria.
Yeah, that's right. Now, in terms of storage, most of the nitrogen stored in the atmosphere, it's like 70 some odd % of our atmosphere is made of nitrogen, N2. You're breathing it in all the time. It doesn't hurt you. It doesn't do anything. It just kind of sits there. So nitrogen is an extremely common gas in the atmosphere, but it's just
the most common gas.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes water vapor overtakes it, depending on how humid it is.
Sure. No, but overall, it's the most.
Yeah. If you just look at the kind of the stable gases in the atmosphere, nitrogen is by far the most common gas. And there we go. And so it's basically this is done by plants and then used by other plants. And so this is one of the reasons when we talk about biodiversity, it's important to have different kind of diversity of life, is because you can have one kind of organism create the resources that another organism needs. You know, if you just have a field of maybe these plants that need the nitrates, right, the NO3s, your soil is going to run out of it because you don't have the legumes or the other kind of plants creating the other forms of nitrogen for you. I know my cousin's a farmer and he's always having to rotate crops, right? So he'll plant like bean and soy and stuff in his field one year, and then that field now for 2 years after it can grow stuff like hay and barley, and then he has to go back and grow these things again.
It's why the Native Americans have the three sisters, right, that they always grow together.
Yes.
It's so that they have that nitrogen going as well. So your winter squash, your corn, and then they have the climbing beans that go through, and that helps with the nitrogen. Exactly right.
Yeah. So if he didn't do that, right? Let's say all he grew was corn, he'd have to dump a ton of nitrogen onto his field in terms of fertilizers, which we're going to talk about being a massive problem, right? So, but nonetheless, here's the nitrogen cycle. It's kind of neat because it really just uses living things to do it. So without living organisms, we wouldn't have this nitrogen in our soil. So there we go. So after carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen is the most abundant element in living things. It's essential for, building a lot of the molecules within you, so like DNA and stuff. Here it says 80%. It's not actually 80. I think it's 70.
70.
Yeah, 70.
Yeah, 70 something.
I don't know. It's old PowerPoint. Maybe it's, who knows. But there we go. Nitrogen fixation. So that's just, we take atmospheric nitrogen. Hang on, I just got to say goodnight. Good night. Have a good nap. Bye. Hello. So we're just changing different kinds of nitrogen until it's a usable form of nitrogen. Lightning can actually create nitrates as well. So if you're wondering how the first set of nitrates were created for whatever, it's through lightning, but it's such a small amount compared to what living organisms do. So there we go. And I think there's actually some trees that will convert thing. I had a professor, Herbert Kronzucker, who studied the reforestation of the hills in Colorado, and they were planting the wrong trees, so they didn't have the right nitrogen. So what he did was he suggested that they plant a different kind of tree in there, one that could use like more of the ammonia-based, and then it grew. And then once those ones died off after 10 years or so, then the right nitrogen was in the soil for other succession of trees to grow. So
yeah,
there's some really cool
trees
videos.
Are a plant.
That's right. So yeah, he was my favorite professor. I can tell you stories about him one day. They're very interesting in the most wonderful way possible. And there we go. So, and then we obtain our nitrogen from plants. So you need to eat plants. Okay, so nitrification and denitrification. So nitrification, that's when we take this ammonia and convert it into nitrate. Okay, and we do that through bacteria.
So we can't use ammonia, but plants can use nitrate, so that's making it something that's useful for us to use, or useful for plants to use, I should say.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the ammonia is what like the beans and stuff are creating, and then bacteria or whatnot converts it into nitrate for us. And then denitrification is where nitrates are converted to the atmosphere by nitrogen by denitrificating bacteria. So now we have these nitrates in the soil, and there's going to be some excess of them. The bacteria will use them to grow, and we'll end up creating N2 for us. So there's one process where we create the nitrates, and then another process where we break down the nitrates. There you go. So a lot of good natural sources, right? Atmosphere to clean plants, you get the bacteria doing it. Human sources, right? We have a lot of legume crops. We use a lot of artificial fertilizers. And there's some really interesting things that happen with nitrogen. In fact, I have a box of it under my desk here because it's near the garden and I use it in my garden all the time. It's because it's a great fertilizer. It makes better crops, helps plants grow. But too much nitrogen can end up killing off the roots. Too much nitrogen, it means it strips all the other resources, so it actually slows down the growth. The leaves, I think they're yellowing, but aren't they basically burning? You're basically
you're basically burning it.
Basically burning them, yeah. Highly acidic soil, which the acid in the soil will break down other nutrients that it needs. If you have too much kind of, you end up getting what's called like nitric acid in the air. It can rain, you can get acid rain, and then eutrophication, which are these algal blooms. I don't think we're going to watch this video, but it's in the PowerPoint if you want to go ahead and watch it. But we'll talk about algal blooms in a second. After phosphorus, because that's part of the process. So phosphorus, this one, I mean, phosphorus is mostly stored in our rocks, right? And then, so it gets in the oceans or water by decaying rocks, right, through erosion, by rain. Now, you notice we don't have phosphorus in the atmosphere. That'd be absolutely frightening if we did. Frightening, but then the phosphorus goes and eventually settles on the bedrock, and then through orographic uplifting, right, through tectonic plate movement and whatnot, they eventually come back up into the mountains and stuff and can go back down. We do have a little phosphorus kind of cycle going here where the stuff in the ground, right in the soil, get converted into plants, and then, you know, stuff like cows or whatever eat them, and then you know, the cows do their thing on the ground, right? They defecate, they poop manure, right? And then that gets into the ground, and then stuff like mushrooms really like to grow on it, or other plants grow on it, and eventually they decompose.
Bacteria.
Yeah, exactly. And then it decomposes and it runs back off through the ground, through groundwater, back into the ocean. So basically everything ends up in the ocean or the bottom of a lake and gets created into rock. And then over millions of years, that rock is pushed back up and then gets withered and leached and runs back down. And then things just use it along the road. And that's also why around rivers specifically, you think of some of the most fertile land are usually on the sides of rivers, and it's because it's carrying this guy with it. Okay. So you think of like Africa or Egypt, right? Like Egypt was kind of the breadbasket of the Mediterranean for thousands of years. It's because of the Nile, which comes from a bunch of big, bunch of hills and mountains, and so it has lots of phosphorus, lots of water, has all the things it needs, right? So there you go. But that's the phosphorus cycle.
This phosphorus is in your DNA. It's part of what makes up the energy within our body to be carried around. It's so important to have.
Yeah, like the ADP, like the ATP, right? So
ATP, yeah.
Yeah, so like when you read, sorry, go ahead.
It's the backbone of your DNA, though.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's not the code; it's the backbone. It's what keeps it stable.
Yeah, it's the phosphorus spine, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there we go. Very important little mineral for us, a nutrient. So yeah, there we go. It's essential for DNA. It's found in rocks. Okay, and then we're just basically weathering them and leaching them, and then the plants and stuff just pick them up as you go along. It's not really in it's in the hydrosphere, but only in the fact that it's being run off from the water, and then as it's settling, things have access to it. Yeah. And then we can, some decomposers can break them down and recycle it. And so this is why having like a compost in your backyard is great, because it'll break down the phosphorus, and then you can put that back into your soil with the nitrogen that's in it. So, and there we go. That's the phosphorus cycle. So before we talk about this other big word here, any questions about those cycles? Those are the four cycles.
So matter, anything with atoms cycles, and energy flows. It's kind of the key remembering. Energy flows one way, but anything with atoms in it actually cycles and moves.
That's right. Okay, so let's talk about an issue called eutrophication. So when we get fertilizers, which usually carry a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus, they run off into a body of water and cause something called algae or algae. How do you say it? My brother always says algae.
I say algae, but
Algae.
it's British versus American, so
Yeah, he's just
they're
trying to be
both
fancy.
they're both correct.
So algae, they use up lots of oxygen from the water and they prevent organisms from getting any. So let's look at a photo that helps show us. And this is all we need to know for eutrophication, basically. So we have sunlight coming into the water, and then we don't think of water like this, but water actually has lots of plants growing on the bottom. Okay, seaweed, seed swelling, or
Sedge.
sedge
That's
grass,
it,
right?
sedge grass. Yeah.
Yeah, sedge grass, right? You can have other things.
Seaweed is not a plant.
Oh no, it's what's it
It's a
called?
protist.
It's a protist, eh?
It's algae. It's actually algae. But
Algae,
okay.
right? So, but then you can also have like lily pads and other little.
Yep. You can have water plants.
Yeah, exactly, right? So you got little water plants, right? So what happens is that we get too much nitrogen and phosphorus in the water. Now, these plants are kind of limited to how much they can grow because they don't have lots of nitrogen and phosphorus around. They kind of grow to a limit and it keeps them in check. Okay. But now we go ahead and dump a lot of these in, and the one that's going to kind of be rewarded the most by this aren't these big plants that take a while to grow. It's going to be the little tiny microscopic ones that can grow really fast, right? And so we have algae, which algae can grow extremely fast. You know, it doesn't have like different systems or whatever. It's just a single cell organism that could go boom, right? It can grow real fast. And so when we kind of hit it with this nitrogen and phosphorus, the algae grows super, super fast, and it eventually covers like the whole surface of the water. Well, the problem with that is that, see this sedge grass? Well, it needs light to live, right? Well, if the algae is covering the whole surface of the water, well, the sedge grass dies. And then the algae dies as well. So now we have everything underneath this algae bloom dying, and then when they're dying, when things decay, it uses oxygen, right? So now you have all this dying algae and all this dying other plants in here with no sun coming in, and all the oxygen being used up. You now have no oxygen in the water. So then all the fish and everything else die off too, and so you end up with all this algae on top that can still kind of live because it can get stuff from the atmosphere, and then everything else below it that just basically dies off. Think of like a nasty looking swamp or a bog, and that's basically what happens. But we can do this by just dumping in nitrogen and phosphorus, and that's what this looks like, right? That's just a little cove in a little lake or stream where it's just covered with algae on top. Underneath, there's no oxygen left. There's nothing living underneath it. It's all dead, right? Now, on a smaller lake or a smaller pond, this could cover the whole lake and you kill off the whole lake. Most bigger lakes, like Lake Ontario or whatnot, you can have this just in small areas, but then the rest of the lake is fine. So it can happen in just little spots, or it can happen for the whole body of water, depending on how big it is. Typically, rivers, it doesn't happen too often because the rivers are flowing, but it can happen. So, but that's basic eutrophication. We put too many nutrients, the algae is able to grow too fast, it covers the top. No more sunlight, algae, plants die, they use up all the oxygen as they decay, then there's no oxygen left in the water, and then everything dies off. Pretty straightforward, right? Any questions about that? Ms. Engelhardt, anything you want to add to that?
Nope, that was pretty clear.
All right, and that's the process of eutrophication. So here we go, a couple of thinking questions that we'll probably just answer here. Where do plants get their water from? Carbon dioxide, nitrogen, phosphorus. So where do plants typically get their water from? Well, usually from the soil, right? I think they can breathe in some through water vapor, right? There are some plants that do that.
Yeah. It's basically I think it's asking for lithosphere. It's asking
okay.
what sphere.
Okay, what sphere? So get their water from? They get it from the hydrosphere, right?
Well, hydrosphere, which they pull up from.
And the lithosphere, yeah.
Lithosphere. Yep.
Carbon dioxide, they're going to get that from the atmosphere, right? And then nitrogen and phosphorus, that's both from the lithosphere as well, right? From the soil.
Yep.
So they're getting 3 out of the 4 things they need from the soil. And how are people changing the carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycles? Well, I think we talked about that, right? And then possible solutions. I don't know. What are some possible solutions? I think it's pretty simple, isn't it? Carbon cycle. Well, burn less of this stuff, you know? Use less fossil fuels. And in the nitrogen cycle, well, are we actually hurting the nitrogen cycle by doing this? I guess when we add fertilizers, when we're adding like legumes and stuff.
But we add too much, yeah.
Yeah. So, and then if you are gonna like be doing like farming where you're putting lots of these nitrogen-rich plants in it, don't do it near like a water source. Right? Or make sure you put the amount of water on the field you need for the field. You don't put too much because then it can still surface runoff. And then in phosphorus, same thing. Don't use fertilizers, right? It's really the fertilizers from phosphates from farming that are the big problem. So. Okay, so that's it for the cycles. Again, if you're watching the video and you have questions, feel free to reach out and let us know, and we're happy to clarify any points. So that's it for this one.